George Miller sat in a large leather chair in an empty room. This house had once been filled with life, the laughter of children, the voices of friends, conversations around the fireplace. Now there was only silence. He looked at the table, where a photo of his wife Susan and 2 children, Michael and Elizabeth, stood. How did I get to this point? He asked himself. His thoughts went back 50 years to when he first realized that money was power. George was young and ambitious. He worked in a factory, but he always dreamed of more. One day, his boss suggested a small gamble hiding some of his profits to avoid taxes. It doesn't mean anything, George. Everyone does it, the boss said. George hesitated but finally agreed. That was the first step. He began to notice how money was changing his life. A few years later, George started his own business. Money was flowing in, and he felt like he was in control. But with the money came the first conflicts. Susan, his wife, began to complain that he no longer spent time with his family. George, our children are growing up without you. You don't even remember the last time you were at their birthday party, she said one evening. George just shrugged his shoulders. Susan, I'm doing this for us, for our future. He didn't notice how he was gradually losing what mattered most. Years passed and George's business flourished. He opened a second company and then a third. Money was coming in faster than he could spend it. And he and Susan moved to a luxurious home in the suburbs of New York City, bought a new car, and their children attended the best schools. On the surface, their life was perfect. But this glitter and wealth hid cracks that were getting bigger and bigger. George began to work even harder. He would wake up at dawn and return home late at night. When Susan asked him why he spent so little time with his family, he always said the same thing: I do it for us, so that you and the kids don't need anything. But Susan knew it was just an excuse. On her own evening, when George came home, Susan was waiting for him in the kitchen. Her eyes were red with tears. George, Michael played in the baseball finals today. He won, and you weren't there, she said, holding up a photo of the game. George waved her off. I can't be everywhere, Susan. I had an important deal to close. Susan silently went to the bedroom, leaving him alone. Over time, the children began to distance themselves from George. Michael, who had always admired his father, stopped asking him for advice. Elizabeth, who loved to read with George before bedtime, now avoided talking to him. One day, when George asked Michael how things were going at school, he replied coldly, Do you really care? You don't even know what grade I'm in. These words struck George, but he didn't show it. At work, things started to get more difficult as well. George, driven by the pursuit of profit, made increasingly risky decisions. He once made a deal that brought him a huge income but left several of his partners in debt. It's just business, he told himself, trying to drown out his conscience. His relationship with his brother, Thomas, was also beginning to crumble. Thomas worked for George, but their conversations were becoming increasingly tense. George, you've turned into a person I don't recognize anymore. All you think about is money, Thomas told him during one of their lunches. George just smiled. Thomas, that's because you don't understand how the world works. If you don't think about money, you end up with nothing. This greed, which seemed to George to be a source of strength, began to alienate everyone he cared about. But he did not notice this. He was so caught up in his success that he did not see how his world was beginning to crumble. George Miller stood in front of the huge window of his office and looked at the panorama of the city. This was his world: tall buildings, expensive cars, and luxurious restaurants. But this brilliance could not hide the darkness that was gradually taking over his life. One day, Thomas came to him with a proposal. George, I want to take out a loan against our family home to start my own business. And I have an idea, and I'm sure it will work, he said, full of enthusiasm. This house was the place where he and Thomas grew up. It had belonged to their parents, and George had always said he would never let it be sold. But this time, something changed in him. His eyes lit up with greed. Thomas, this is risky. I can't let you use the house as collateral. But if you want, I can buy out your share and take the house for myself, George said. Thomas was shocked. You want to take our house? This is what is important to us. I came to you for help, not to lose everything," he exclaimed. George remained cool. "Thomas, this is a business. If you don't want to sell, then don't come to me with such offers," he replied. A few days later, Thomas signed the documents. He was forced to sell his share because he had no other choice. Actually, George bought the house at a low price, but this decision was the beginning of the end of their relationship. Susan found out about this act and was furious. "George, how could you do that to your brother? It was wrong," she said. It's just business, Susan." Thomas knew what he was doing, George replied, trying to justify himself. But inside he felt he was losing something more than a house. And the situation worsened when Michael and Elizabeth learned of the incident. "Dad, you always said that family is the most important thing, and now you've betrayed Uncle Thomas for money," Michael said. We don't want to be a part of this," Elizabeth added. These words hurt George, but he didn't show it. He was too proud to admit his mistakes. One day Thomas came to George's office to say goodbye. Don't want to do business with you anymore. You're not my brother anymore," he said, looking George straight in the eye. These words left George face to face with his choice. He had reached the pinnacle of wealth, but the price he paid was too high. The next few George's life became a cold and lonely pursuit of money. There was no more childish laughter in his luxurious home, no more conversations with his brother, or Susan's warm embrace. Susan left, unable to bear his indifference. She took the children and said, "George, you chose money. I choose family." George watched her go but said nothing, justified himself with the idea that he was doing it for them. But deep inside, he felt his world becoming more empty with each step Susan took. His relationship with Michael and Elizabeth also collapsed. Michael moved to another state and started working at a factory, refusing to accept financial assistance from his father. "Dad, I don't want your money. I want you to be a person I can look up to," he said before he left. And Elizabeth rarely answered his calls, and on holidays she only sent him cards, which he kept in his desk drawer. However, what tormented George the most was what happened to Thomas. His brother, who had always supported him, was now living in a small apartment and struggling to make ends meet. One day George tried to contact him, but Thomas answered, "George, I don't want to hear from you. You have betrayed me, and that cannot be changed." Left alone, George began to think about his life. He had everything money could buy, but he felt like the poorest man in the world. One evening, sitting in his empty house, he opened the safe and looked at his financial statements. The numbers on paper no longer brought him joy. "What's in it for me if I've lost everyone I love?" he thought. His health began to deteriorate. Doctors warned him about the need to change his lifestyle, but George did not pay attention. He worked late into the night, trying to numb his loneliness. One day, on his way home from work, George noticed a family walking in the park. The man was holding a little boy in his arms, and the woman was laughing as she watched him try to catch a butterfly. This scene brought back memories of the times he used to walk with Susan and his children. "Why did I let this disappear?" he asked himself. George realized that his life was coming to an end, and he would be alone in it. But is there still time to make something right? One morning, feeling heavy in his heart, George decided that he couldn't just sit there and regret the past. He needed to make at least one attempt to reconnect with his family. He started with Michael. After much hesitation, George called his son, and to his surprise, Michael answered. "Dad, what do you want?" His voice was cold, but not aggressive. "Michael, I want to see you. I just want to talk to you. Can you find time for me?" George asked. Michael was silent for a long time, but eventually agreed. The meeting took place in a small cafe near the factory where Michael worked. George was nervous but tried not to show it. "Michael, I know I've made a lot of mistakes. I'd like to start from scratch," he said. Michael looked at him, folding his hands on the table. "Dad, you always said you did everything for your family, but I never saw it. Everything you did was for the money, and when you lost us, you didn't even try to get us back," he replied. George felt these words pierce him to the core. "I know, Michael. I thought money could make us happy, but I was wrong. And I realize now that the most valuable thing I ever had was you and Elizabeth and your mother, and I ruined it all." he said, looking his son in the eyes. Michael softened a little, but remained restrained. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Dad, but maybe we can start with small steps, he said. Elizabeth was next. She lived in another city, but after talking to Michael, she agreed to meet with her father. In their meeting was even more difficult. Elizabeth reminded George how she had always tried to get his attention, but always felt that money was more important to him. You didn't even come to my graduation, Dad. It was the most important day of my life, and you weren't there, she said, tears in her eyes. George could not deny anything. He just nodded and said, You are right, Elizabeth. I was blind. I did not see that I was losing the most important thing. But please, give me a chance to try to make things right. Elizabeth also agreed to try to repair the relationship, even though her trust in her father had been shattered. The most difficult meeting was with Thomas. George showed up at his brother's doorstep unannounced. What do you want? Thomas asked when he saw him. Thomas, I've come to ask for forgiveness, George said, looking down. Thomas was silent for a long time and then invited him inside. You betrayed me, George. You destroyed everything we had. Why should I trust you now? He said. George told him about his loneliness, how he had realized his mistakes, and how he wanted to make things right. I'm not asking you to forget, Thomas, but I hope you can forgive, he said. Thomas looked at him with sadness. George, forgiveness is not easy, but maybe you have changed. Give me time to think about it. These meetings were the first steps for George to reconnect. But he knew that trust is not rebuilt in one conversation. Several months had passed since George had ventured out to meet with his children and brother. Each of these meetings was filled with emotion, and although forgiveness was not yet complete, for the first time, hope was in George's heart. One morning, he woke up to sunlight streaming through the curtains of his bedroom. There was something symbolic about it. After years of darkness and loneliness, it seemed that a ray of light had appeared in his life. George decided to invite the whole family to his home. It was a difficult decision, but he wanted to bring everyone together, even if it was the last time. I don't know if they'll agree, but I have to try, he said to himself, holding the phone in his hands. To his surprise, everyone agreed. Michael, Elizabeth, and even Thomas came. Their faces were serious, but they came. At the table, George stood up and said, I have not gathered you here to make excuses. I know I have caused you a lot of pain, but I want you to know that I am sorry for my mistakes. The money I valued so much did not make me happy. It has alienated me from the most important people in my life, you. Elizabeth was the first to break the silence. Dad, I was angry with you for a long time, but now I see that you really want to make things right. I don't know if I can forgive you completely, but I'm willing to try. Michael adding, Dad, I can see how you've changed too, but trust is not something that comes back overnight. Let's try to rebuild our relationship. Thomas, who had been silent all this time, finally said, George, I can't forget what you did, but I can see that you are sorry. Maybe we can be brothers again, but it will take time. George felt tears filling his eyes. Thank you. This is more than I deserve, he said, looking at his children and brother. The evening ended with warm conversations and even a few smiles. George realized that this was only the beginning, but this time he was ready to fight for his relationship. A few weeks later, George went to the park where he used to walk with his children when they were young. He sat on a bench and watched the families walking by. I've made a lot of mistakes, but maybe all is not lost, he thought. Friends, this story reminds us that true wealth is our relationships with our loved ones. If it touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel. We talk about real life which makes you think and inspires change. Thank you for being with us.